Hello, my name is Tabitha, and in this video I will be presenting my findings based on my own research question, which is concerned with understanding willingness to communicate and implications for the classroom. To start, my research question is, what are the most prominent affective factors that determine student willingness to communicate in the L2, and what steps may be taken to increase student willingness to communicate in the foreign language classroom? I'm sure we've all had the experience, particularly in a language classroom, where a prompt to speak up or answer a question has been met with silence because no one is willing to try to speak up. I was interested in discovering what effective factors are at play during this moment and which are most prominent or important in determining student willingness to communicate in the L2. I also wanted to briefly look at ways the classroom could be changed or arranged to promote student willingness to communicate in the L2, because I feel like looking at and considering implications for the classroom setting is important for helping foster foreign language acquisition in the classroom setting. So getting into it, I first wanted to briefly introduce some key terms that I'll be using during this video. Some of them are self-explanatory or ones that we have already encountered in our text, but I wanted to help you get them in your head before I got into describing them in more detail and such. To start, I have a simple definition of willingness to communicate, which is, as our textbook puts it, an underlying continuum representing the predisposition towards or away from communicating given the choice. In the next slide, I will talk about willingness to communicate more, but this is a good starting point. Next is self-confidence, which can be defined as the learner's overall belief in being able to communicate in the L2 in an adaptive and efficient manner. Then there is language anxiety, which can be defined as the worry and usually negative emotional reaction aroused when learning in L2. Next is perceived communicative competence, which can be defined as the learner's own perception or belief of their level of speaking ability in the L2. Then there is motivation, which is defined in our textbook as the choices made about goals to pursue and the effort extended towards their completion. Now, after introducing the key terms, I want to go over explaining the concept of willingness to communicate a bit more in depth. So willingness to communicate is understood to be a situation-dependent dynamic construct that changes over time and according to the situation. It is affected by both trait-like factors such as personality and state-like factors such as the specific speaking partner in the moment. So basically, the deciding affective factors of willingness to communicate are hard to pin down in research because of how complicated it gets when considering the multitude of factors at different levels and how they affect it and work together. But it is worthwhile to look at and look into because willingness to communicate is the most immediate determinant of the learner's degree of actual L2 use. And with trends of the foreign language classroom going more and more towards a conversational approach to prepare the learner for spoken use of the language, willingness to communicate in L2 learners is important because the learners must practice communicatively using the language to develop their communicative proficiency and fluency. Now, with us having a bit more understanding of willingness to communicate as a concept and why it is important to research and understand for language learning, I want to go on to explaining what all factors are at play when a learner chooses to use the L2 or not in the classroom. To do this, I'll be looking at the pyramid model of willingness to communicate. In this model, the layers go from more proximal to more distal influence of the specific moment of L2 use, with layers 6 through 4 being influences that consistently endure over time, and layers 3 through 1 being situational influences and outcomes that can change according to the scenario. Starting with layer 6, the most distal influence to the moment of actual L2 use, there is intergroup climate and personality. Intergroup climate can be thought of as the shared traits of the learner's group or culture, and personality is the learner's own enduring traits. Then there is layer 5, which is intergroup attitudes, social situation, and communicative competence. Here I want to make the distinction between communicative competence and learner perceived communicative competence, because a learner can very well be more communicatively competent overall than they feel in a certain moment, and that would affect how willing they are to communicate. Then moving on to layer 4, This is where we get into the enduring motivations of both the learner in interpersonal and the learner's group in intergroup, and the learner's overall L2 self-confidence, not specific to the moment though. In layer 3 is where there is a shift from enduring influences to situational ones, with the learner's current state of communicative self-confidence and immediate desire or motivation to communicate with a specific person in the L2. These are the two affective factors I will be going into more detail on, since they are the most immediate determiners of the L2 learner's willingness to communicate, and thus they determine the actual use of the L2. An important note on willingness to communicate in layer 2 is that it can occur on a spectrum. So the learner can be anywhere from readily willing to communicate in the L2 to reluctant, which will determine the actual use of the L2. It determines if they are chatterboxes, or if they are sparse and short in their utterances, or if they're even mute. With the pyramid model of willingness to communicate out of the way, I want to go into more detail on desire to communicate with a specific person and state-specific communicative self-confidence, since they are the most immediate influences of willingness to communicate and thus actual L2 use. I will start with self-confidence because in reading through my sources, it seems that research is leaning more toward self-confidence as being the more determinant factor of willingness to communicate. Though they ultimately work together to determine the level of the learner's willingness to communicate. So from my understanding, the outcome of self-confidence in the L2 is ideally formed from high perceived communicative competence and low language anxiety in the learner. However, if the opposite is true for either perceived communicative competence or language anxiety, the learner's self-confidence is impacted, and so is their willingness to speak. Learners' self-confidence in the L2 can also change given time or the specific scenario because of the changing nature of both perceived communicative competence and language anxiety. With perceived communicative competence over time and with progression in the language learning, it can go up and result in a more confident learner. However, it could also go down should the learner have negative influences on their confidence in the L2, like overusing negative feedback by the teacher to the point of hindering the learner's overall belief in their ability to use the L2. Language anxiety can also change or not change over time by occurring on different levels, which are trait level, situation-specific level, and state level. Starting with trait level anxiety, it is the enduring pattern of anxiety in a learner, so this would be someone that can be described as always anxious, and that will affect their self-confidence overall. Then situation-specific anxiety is anxiety that is only enduring in a specific situation. So this would describe a learner that is anxious about speaking in the L2, but not in the L1, and will affect their self-confidence only when speaking in the L2. Lastly, state level anxiety describes anxiety of the current moment in the learner, and this level isn't really concerned with finding an enduring pattern on the trait or situation specific level. So it isn't connected to an established pattern, but nonetheless, the learner is currently anxious or not, and their level of self-confidence is affected either way in the moment of deciding willingness to communicate. This state level of anxiety and also the specific moment of perceived communicative confidence is the level of self-confidence that the model pyramid is most concerned with as being an immediate determinant of willingness to communicate. So now I am moving on to the learner's desire to communicate with a specific person as another immediate determinant of willingness to communicate. This can be affected by both the relationship between the learner and the communicative partner and the motivational type of the learner. So the relationship can vary widely between the learner and communicative partner, being anything from teacher to student, friend to friend, or stranger to stranger, and this will affect how willing the learner is to communicate with that person in the L2. For example, if the student is speaking with a friend that speaks the L2 as a native language, it is reasonable to believe that they will have a higher desire towards communicating in the L2 with that friend than with trying to strike up a conversation with a random stranger on the street that speaks the L2. This can also be affected by motivational types, though. There are two motivational types towards language learning, according to my research, which are integrative and instrumental. Integrative can be used to describe L2 learners that are directly interested in the target group, or target language, the target culture, and its people, and that is their driving force for learning. Then instrumental motivation would describe learners that are interested in the utility of the target language, such as the enhanced aptitude as a job candidate. Um, Taking into consideration the different motivational types, the relationship between learner and communicative partner can shape desire for communication differently. For example, an integrative learner may be more interested in striking up a conversation with a native speaker of the L2, even if they are a stranger, because they are interested in the people and culture of the language. Considering the opposite, an instrumental learner would probably be less interested in speaking with a stranger because they aren't concerned with the people and culture behind the language. They would probably rather just focus on learning in the classroom to effectively speak the language in the workplace down the road, which would drive them to be more willing to communicate in the classroom, but less so outside of the classroom. Um, this outcome of desire to communicate with the specific speaker in the L2, combined with the state level self-confidence of the learner resulting from the level of language anxiety and perceived communicative competence, results in the level of willingness to communicate of the learner specific to a particular moment in time. So if desire to communicate with a specific person and self-confidence of the learner is key to determining willingness to communicate in the L2, what implications does this have for the classroom setting? What could teachers do to facilitate willingness to communicate in the classroom? Here I would like to show a clip from a video about safe speaking environments because I feel it would be better understood from the speaker himself, Zoltan Dornier, than me trying to summarize it. The part I'm showing is particularly listing 5 principles of a safe speaking environment, which are basically some tips a teacher can take to improve group dynamics within the classroom and also improve student willingness to speak as a result. So without further ado, here is the clip.
So, principle number 1, allowing adequate time and space for speaking in the syllabus and in individual lessons. And you would think that this is, self-evident, but the fact is that we don't actually very often. Automatization, which in psychology, basically fluency is called automatization, and we know it very well from skill learning theory that it takes time. It's just like, it's exactly the same thing as when you learn to drive and you are already the practice stage, you simply have to put in the hours to become an automatic driver and a safe driver. Now, syllabus priorities very often work against this because very often exams dominate and most exams won't have a proper speaking component simply because it's too expensive. So, entrance exams for universities and all, I think you know this very well. So the first thing is we have to give speaking simply a chance by giving it, spending enough time. The second thing is what's called immersing learners in activities where speaking English almost feels incidental to the task. So when it's by incidental, it means it's kind of natural. So when the task drives the communication, and obviously in communicative language teaching, that has been a principle from day one. How to create communicative tasks which approximate communication, real communication as much as we can. And of course, quizzes, games, there are ways when students can forget about being students and just, enjoy the task. Also, one thing is which is really useful in this respect is when you set up tasks when students can collaborate. So kind of project work, role play activities, because that takes almost like takes the edge off. So when you know that you are not exposed yourself, but it's kind of teamwork, you can get support from others, that makes it much more natural and students relax more. The third principle is using student-selected topics for discussion to increase engagement. Now, one thing which personalized tasks, by definition, create autonomy and ownership, and this kind of, this feel of realness and authenticity is a big motivational force. And just to give you one example, one of my most successful language tasks at the very beginning of my teaching, when I was teaching English in Hungary, it was still communist Hungary, and we were using building strategies. That was my first course book. I will never forget Barbara Cartland, the shoe shop manager, and there was also a Canadian electrical engineer in that. And what we did, there was this wonderful dialogue, and all I asked my students is to kind of rewrite the dialogue as if it happened in Hungary or at home. And it was hilarious. In the shoe shop there were no shoes because they ran out. Or when there was a family scene, which was lovely and cozy, and the students actually produced a massive quarrel, and they say, that's what always happens on Sundays, And suddenly they are motivated. Okay, fostering positive interaction between peers, and you can see this is directly related to cohesiveness. The point here is that by actually students learning about each other, interacting with each other, they can reach a psychological state which is called acceptance, in contrast to attraction. Acceptance is something when you accept someone as a human being with perhaps some faults, but who is one of us. Like an uncle or aunt who drinks and sometimes kicks the dog, but we still like him. Or perhaps not. Okay. One good way of fostering positive interactions, which comes from cooperative learning, the methodology, is to give students roles. Students actually love having some roles, that you are the secretary, you are the timekeeper. So I'm not just talking about role play activities, you are the shop assistant and you are the customer, but also some kind of group roles. Your task is to make sure that everybody communicates. They like that because they have something to do and which they can understand. And finally, providing appropriate feedback on learners speaking. Now, this is quite difficult. Lots of things can go wrong. So far, you've got everything right, and the feedback can spoil everything, because the issue here is that you want to give meaningful feedback, but it cannot be intrusive to the task. Okay, so you don't want to discourage people. You don't want to stop the task and say, let's just say this again, for obvious reasons. So what do? Well, there are books written about this, but this is what I would say, that one thing you must avoid is this sense that the students are being judged, okay? Because that creates a mindset, like that. What actually, some of the best feedback is not really focusing on what you didn't get right, but things which could have made things better. So offering useful additional resources, saying that many of you use this, use this language function, in the let's say, role play activities. Here's a useful phrase which you can use next time in that. So that kind of feedback students find very, very inspiring.
So after that clip, I would like to finish this video with a bit of a concluding slide that recaps highlights of this presentation. To start, willingness to communicate in a learner is a dynamic and situation-specific construct that is affected by a wide variety of factors. However, The most immediately influential factors that determine how willing the learner is to communicate in the L2 are their desire to communicate with a specific person and their current state of self-confidence. Self-confidence can fluctuate over time and according to the situation, as perceived communicative competence of the learner and levels of language anxiety change. Um, the desire to communicate with the specific person can also change over time and across situations because of relation dynamics and motivational types, which can be divided into integrative and instrumental. Finally, teachers in a foreign language classroom can follow 5 principles to help create a classroom that is a safe speaking environment for learners to help facilitate willingness to speak to promote learner growth towards communicative competence. These principles are to provide adequate time and space for speaking, utilize immersive activities, incorporate student-selected topics, foster a positive peer interaction, and give appropriate feedback. Information on all of the sources I've used for reference can be found in the description below, and I hope you enjoyed my presentation. Thank you for watching.